Hey guys, Elliot here. So in my last video, I was saying how if you're a beginner, do not get an inline 4. Going totally bonkers about that. Um, and while I definitely stand by that, it's actually not entirely true. Now, if you're a beginner, like an absolute beginner, you want to start out on a really small bike. You like a 250, a 300, like a Rebel 250, Ninja 300, the R3, the Honda CB 300F, whatever it is. Just these little bikes. But you probably will get bored of that really quick, and you might start thinking about getting an intermediate bike. And maybe even as a beginner, you might be able to handle an intermediate bike. If you are thinking of that mid-range kind of size of a bike, basically what I was saying, and what I still say is, if you have your heart set on that, you should get a twin, get a two-cylinder, because a four-cylinder has super horsepower and it's going to be too much for you to handle. Now, again, while there's definitely some truth to that, there's actually a subset of bikes that I didn't even realize were there that maybe a beginner or a slightly intermediate kind of rider could get accustomed to or could be safe starting out on. And I'm going to get into that later, and I'll tell you what those bikes are. But there's actually so ideally, if you are going to get a mid-size bike, you're going to want to get something like the FZ07, a twin, the SV650, a twin, which is what I have, the Ninja 650, a CB500F, something like that. Now, the reason I was saying you don't want to get a four-cylinder, which would be, and in that context of what I was talking about, I was saying, the R6 or the Gixxer 600 or the Ninja gsx-r or the CBR 600RR. Like all those bikes, even though they're pretty much the same size engine, because they're inline 4s, they're four cylinders instead of two, because they're built to rev super high, they can generate a lot more horsepower. And those bikes that I just mentioned and that I was referring to are definitely basically race bikes, and they take them and they tweak them a little bit so that you can ride them on the streets. But they're designed so that all the power is in the top end. So at the top end of the RPM range is when the power really kicks in. And relatively speaking, it's actually not much horsepower in the low end of the range. So for city riding, you'd actually be happier anyway with the two-cylinder. And those inline 4s have crazy power, and you kind of don't want to get into that if you're a beginner. But there's actually these bikes that kind of span the gap between these twins and these inline 4s that are the same or relatively the same CCs, the same kind of bike. And it's really interesting. So the R6, for example, definitely a race bike. And of all of like the Gixxer, the CBR, the Ninja, the R6 is definitely the one that is for the track, like best for the track if you're super good, because they really squeeze all the power right at the top end, and there's not really much to work with, relatively speaking, on the lower end. So even if you are going to the track, and you're watching this video, if you're a total expert, you're not going to be watching this video. So, but if you're going to the track, you're going to be happier probably with the Gixxer or the Ninja or the Honda, the CBR. But there are actually these four cylinders that bridge the gap between these twins and these inline 4s, or I should say these inline 4 race bikes. So what they have actually, and I didn't know about this, is they have pretty much all these brands, Honda, Kawasaki, Yamaha, Suzuki. They have a bike where they take their go-to inline 4 race bike and they retune it, they re-gear it, they tweak it so that the power delivery is more even throughout the RPMs. and they change the geometry. They'll take off the clip-ons and they'll put on kind of a standard sort of handlebars, and they'll make the seating so it's more upright, and they'll just kind of turn it into a standard bike, you know? So by default, what I used to think of an inline-4, when I think of an inline-4, I think of a super sport instead of a sport, you know? Or you know, so there you have like the standards, and then you have the super sport bikes. And I always kind of thought of the inline-4s as a super sport bike, but these bikes are actually more in the standard bike category. Okay, so let's take Yamaha for example. They took the R6, same engine, they retuned it, gave it different geometry, and they called it the FZ6R. And it's a lot cheaper too. And that bike is kind of like the R6 with the balls ripped out, you know? It's definitely not an R6. It like kind of just doing all those changes, it falls into a totally different category. It's not a race bike anymore. It's a bike for city riding, for commuting, and that's how they market it, you know, but it's an inline-4. So it's going to have kind of, if you move from a twin to an inline-4, you're going to sacrifice torque. You just give up torque, period. That's what's good if they're the same size engine, you know? There's not much you can do about that. It's not going to be gigantic necessarily, but in the inline-4, the torque that you get is going to be further down the RPM range, you know? Higher up in the RPMs is when the torque, it takes longer for the torque and the horsepower to kick in. So the R6, for example, the torque is 40 at 12,000 RPMs. The FZ6R, which what I'm talking about is the same bike, but they retune it for commuting and city riding. You get basically the same torque, but at 8,000 RPMs. So you get that torque sooner. So if you're splitting lanes in slow traffic, or if you're coming off of a stoplight, you know, a red light, whatever, you get that little torque a little bit earlier, which is nice, which is good for city riding. If you're in the track where it's go, 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 doesn't matter. But if you're riding in the city, it's kind of nice to have that torque, you know. So, and then you have the SV650, which I'm riding. You get 47 at 7,000 RPMs. So you definitely have more torque. You get the torque earlier. You know, it's the low end torque, which is nice. But you don't have that super crazy with the SV650 with the twin or a V-twin. You know, you don't get that super crazy high-end power delivery, like that horsepower that you get with an R6. And I frankly don't really want that. I mean, I'm kind of getting the itch to, I'm actually getting a little bored of my SV650, and I kind of want to get a race bike. But these bikes, the FZ6R, not to be confused with the R6, kind of bridges the gap between the two. You know, you gain some horsepower early on in the, you know, you get with the FZ6R, you get your horsepower at 8,000 RPMs instead of 12,000 RPMs. But of course, you're not going to have that screaming horsepower that the R6 offers. And frankly, I don't think you really need it, you know, because the R6 will give you 110 horsepower at 14,000 RPMs. But the FZ6R will give you 90 at 12,000, and the SV650 will give you 70 at 9,000. So with the twins, you basically get that lower end, you get that instant gratification for stop and go scenarios, which is what city riding is, you know, in my opinion, and is not so much the case for racing. But it's nice that they kind of that Yamaha came out with this bike that spans between a twin. You know, they have their FZ07. I'm not really mentioning the FZ07 too much because, you know, it is a little bit bigger, the engine, and I think that the SV650 is probably a better approximation. But, and that's what I'm writing. But it's kind of interesting, you know, and these brands, they all do the same thing. The so Yamaha, they're kind of I guess you could say their toned down inline-4 is the FZ6R, and with Suzuki, their toned down inline-4 is, okay, originally they have the Gixxer 750, for example, you know, the gsx-r 750. Well, they have the gsx-s 750, same bike, but they retune it, they change the geometry, and voila, it's a city bike, it's a commuter bike, it has the torque. You get the torque low end. You know, they kind of smooth it out so that you get that even power delivery, and you don't have the power, crazy power, kick in at just the last moment. You know, it's kind of interesting. And then Kawasaki, let's say they have the gsx-r. Well, the closest thing to it, but is kind of what I'm talking about, is they have the Z800. So there's no X. So I guess that means it's not extreme or whatever. They kind of take a bike and they kind of smooth out the power delivery and retune it so that, and they kind of take the fairings off, you know, and they say, okay, here's your city bike, your naked city bike, right? Or a more close example, let's say they have the ZX10. Well, they also have the Z1000, and they totally classify these two different bikes, the ZX10 and the Z1000, in two totally different categories. Kawasaki will call it the Sport and the Super Sport. The Super Sport being the ZX10, and the Sport, in other words, the less sporty, the Z1000. And all that they're really doing is like, yeah, they're both inline fours, they're both 1,000 cc's, but the Super Sport is tuned to have that super crazy power delivery in the top end. The geometry is totally nuts. But then the Sport or City version, or the standard version, the Z1000, same size engine, but they retune it and they change the geometry and a couple things, and it's more appropriate when you have fucking crazy cagers all over the place. Okay, and then Honda, the CB500F, which would be like their twin option. But if you want an inline four, you basically actually don't have to choose the CBR600RR. You can go with the CBR650F. Kind of interesting, where they take more or less the same kind of bike, where it's an inline four, and they're like, you know what, let's kind of make this so that people riding in the city and who aren't trying to win races can have an inline four. And they smooth it out. They give you a torque a little bit lower down. You know, it's really nice. So if you kind of want, you know, you don't really want a twin, or maybe you want a little more horsepower or a lot more horsepower because you're on the freeways all the time and you really want that instant passing power, you might want to give a shot to these bikes. You know, you don't have to get the R6. If you want an inline four, you don't have to get an R6. You don't have to get a Gixxer 600, a Gixxer 750, or a Ninja ZX-6R, or a CBR 600RR. You can get the FZ6R, the GSX-s 750, the Ninja Z800, you know, or the CBR 650F. You actually have options. It's really nice to have a bike that's still an inline four that bridges the gap. So that's what I learned. You know, still, I would not recommend it for beginners. Even that, definitely don't get an inline four, one of these race bikes like the R6 or the ZX-s-r. My first video, actually, I made that video saying, if you're a beginner, don't get an inline four. I showed it to my buddy at work. You know, I made him watch it before he got his Kawasaki, his Ninja. And I was like, dude, don't do it. And he still went ahead and did it. He got the ZX-6R, didn't take the MSF class, didn't get a license, didn't get insured, and 3 out of the 4 trips that he, of the rides he went on, he got in an accident. And now his shoulder's all fucked up, his arm is all screwed up. Like, it's no joke, man. These bikes have power, and if you're a beginner, don't even think about it, man. At least get a license in the MSF class, you know. So that's it, my advice. Do what you want, and happy riding.